Welcome to A Shelter in the Time of Storm. My name is Roger Comstock. I preach for the Morrison Church of Christ in Morrison, Tennessee. We're glad that you could join us today. And let me mention, I want to thank those of you who have called and sent cards and notes and emails and encouragement about the program. We want this program to be a program that will be of help in those difficult times in people's lives, that they can maintain their faith and their trust in God, even in the face of difficult situations. We've been talking about the traumatic event that we call suicide. And this is a very difficult subject, and it plagues so many people in our nation today. There are approximately 36,000 suicides every year, ranks 10th on the list of causes of death in our nation. It ranks 3rd among young people as a cause of death. And so this is an important subject. With every suicide, there are at least, statistically speaking, there are at least 6 people who are directly connected. And these numbers that I've shared with you, there's some difficulty even in acquiring these numbers. And the situation really complicates the statistical data that is available. The most recent data that I was able to acquire in preparation for these programs was from 2008, nearly 3 years ago. And that's the most recent data I was able to find. And even what data is available is somewhat unreliable, certainly wouldn't make it just hard, absolute facts, because it's very difficult in gathering this information. There are a number of different reasons for that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. With suicide, it's interesting that some of the data that we do have available, there are, for example, the rates of suicide, if you went state by state, the rate of suicide is higher in western states, particularly all the way to the Pacific, than it is in the farther eastern states. The higher rates are in cities rather than rural areas. Interesting, San Francisco maybe could be given the title, the suicide capital. More suicides there than any other general location. It's interesting also that April and May are the primary months, or the peak months of when suicides are committed, with the exception of the time around the Christmas holidays. And interesting also, Monday and Friday are the peak days of the week, speaking statistically about the suicide data. And so this information is interesting, but yet it doesn't really come into play as far as your given situation. As I mentioned a moment ago, some of the data, the information is difficult to acquire because of the way people deal with suicide. Families many times will do everything in their ability to suppress the fact of the suicide. And thus, collecting data and information and so forth sometimes is somewhat complicated. There is an inconsistency in reporting methods from bureau to bureau, and different law enforcement people and coroners and all those things that are involved, and that contributes to the difficulty. And there is also that there are roughly 15 to 20% of deaths that happen that are sort of labeled unknown, you might say, that they are sort of ambiguous, that it cannot be determined for sure whether it was an accidental death or a crime had been involved or a suicide. Some are just about 15 to 20% are just unknown. And then there are also those who are people who are just willfully self-destructive. And sometimes that doesn't reflect in the numbers. Sometimes people will put themselves in situations where they are likely to be killed, or that things might happen that will lead to their death, and those things are never counted statistically as far as suicides are concerned. For example, single car accidents, and oftentimes it is suspected that it may have been suicide, but many times we just cannot know for sure. Some contend that the actual numbers that we have really ought to be multiplied by 3 to have the real number of what really is happening in the numbers and the statistical data concerning suicides. I want to talk about some myths about suicide for a moment, and hopefully we'll get to, so I want to spend some time in this program and talking about children and the effects of grieving and suicide on the surviving children is my plan for today. Some of the myths that are involved, I'll just give you these as if they're quotations. A person who talks about suicide would never really do it. One who talks about killing themselves, they'll never do it. That's a myth. It certainly is not true. Another myth, suicide happens without warning, just on the spur of the moment. It does, but the majority of times there are some warning signals. They estimate as much as 80 to 90% of the time there are some warning signs that are there and could be recognized. Another myth that would say that all the people who attempt suicide are fully intent on dying. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes people will attempt suicide as a cry for help, and they have come to, in their mind, whether true or not true, whether accurate or not, they've come in their mind to believe that the only way they can get attention for what their need is by attempting to take their own life. Sadly, sometimes those people are successful when they don't want to be successful. Sad. Another myth that if a person attempts suicide once, that he'll continue to do it and continue to struggle and will always have these suicidal impulses. That's not true at all. Sometimes we don't have time to go into it today, but whatever the situation, when it's resolved, then the threat of suicide maybe is also relieved. Another myth that we hear from time to time is that only the psychotic, only those who have a mental illness, a crazy person, that's the only one who would really take their own life. And again, that's not true either. There are people who take their own life for a cause, not because of something personal in their mind or some problem or that they're crazy. They do it for a cause, like some of these groups of cults where people have taken their own lives. Another fallacy, another myth is that suicide is hereditary. That if one family member takes their life, then it's likely that others in the family will do the same, as if there were some genetic connection. Well, that certainly is not true, because we are all individuals. We all make our own choices, and certainly we are free to make those choices as we see fit. No one can stop us. We're free moral agents, every one of us. Another myth is that suicide is a rich man's disease, but it's a poor woman's way out, is a statement that had been made in the years past. Again, there's no truth to that. In fact, it's just many of the statistics would indicate just the opposite. Another fallacy, another myth is that every true suicide leaves a suicide note. Well, that's not true. It's not true at all. There certainly are a number of examples that could be given that's not the case, where we can know it was a suicide and yet no note of any kind was left. Sometimes family members will destroy suicide notes as if they want it to be known that it was just an accident or something of that nature. Another myth is that you should never talk about suicide with a depressed person, because you don't want to put that idea in their mind. Well, again, that's not true at all. And if a person is depressed, you need to give additional, be a little more vigilant in watching and showing concern for them, and look for those signs of those requests for help that are being given. Let's talk about children for a moment for the rest of our program, and children that survive the suicide event in their family's life. You know, children grieve too. Sometimes we don't think so. Sometimes we think children aren't affected by the loss of life and these things, especially younger children. Well, children certainly do grieve, but they grieve a little differently than we adults do. We've done a program in the past about the grieving of children and some things that are typically true of children that are grieving. But particularly in a suicide situation, we need to be very cautious and really be helpful to children, because it creates all kinds of additional questions and doubts and fears within a child. Children's depending on their age, whether very young, say 3 or 4 years old, or in adolescence, 10 or 12 years old, or in the teenage years, the thought process is different than for most adults. Children have difficulty thinking in the abstract. We do as well, but we do a little better maybe than children do. But telling a child about heaven, something they can't touch and feel and smell, that's difficult for a child to comprehend. And that's why I believe that the Bible teaches that it is believers who can respond to the gospel invitation, to the gospel message. And it's believers that God calls to obedience, because we should have a better grasp of things that are in the abstract, where children rely on things that are a little more concrete. With children and the grief of children involved in a suicide situation, first of all, the priority must be the children. The focus, the attention needs to be on them and their well-being, their mental well-being, their physical well-being certainly, but how they're dealing with the emotional things that are going on in their own bodies and what's going on with the family around them. It's difficult when you're hurting. It's difficult to put your attention on someone else, but the surviving spouse and the surviving children, that surviving spouse, whether the husband or the wife, need to pay special attention to those children. They need to become their priority above your own, and sometimes that's very difficult. In children's minds, as we said, they work different than adults do. So we need to be cautious, and we need to look for the emotions being displayed. We need to be willing to kind of get down on their level. You know, I guess most of you are aware, marketing schemes in stores, the things that children like candy and so forth, certain toys and so forth. In the stores, they put them on the level, the shelf that's a little lower to the ground, so there'll be eye level to the child. And then the child will pester mama until mama buys for the child. Well, that's what I mean when we need to get down on the child's level. We can't just talk to them as if they were adults. We need to try to talk to them on their level. And that can be very difficult sometimes. Sometimes in suicide situations, the children become the casualties if we're not very cautious, if we don't take care. One of the things I strongly encourage, and we've talked about this in previous programs as well, I personally believe, and I think most of those who have studied in the area of grief and child psychology and so forth, there needs to be an honesty involved in working with the children. That's hard. I'm not suggesting that you give them all the gory details. I'm not suggesting that at all. But you need to be honest with them. You need to tell them the facts and just be honest. Be straightforward with them. They can handle it, but you have to be honest with them. You need to talk to them. You need to explain to them what a suicide is and what that means and what the individual did. A lot of times parents avoid the subject. They avoid the subject of death altogether. But children need to be treated in a way that they can continue their trust in you as an adult and as their parent especially. In a recent survey of 36 children who were the survivors where suicide was involved, of those 36 children that were questioned, none of them were told that it was a suicide. Now, maybe that's just coincidence, but not likely. 36 maybe you think is not a large number, but none of them were told that this was a suicide that took place in their family. The thing is, they're going to find out. When they go to school, the other children are going to know, and they'll talk about it. The community is going to know, and sometime, somehow, somewhere, they're going to learn about the suicide that happened in their family. And the end result of that is going to be they're going to look at you and say, you weren't honest with me. Now, they may not verbalize that, but that's going to be the response. That's going to be the reaction to your lack of honesty. And you think, well, I just want to protect them. This is a difficult time, and I want to protect them. That's not the way to protect them, keeping them from the truth. These are difficult things, but you have to be very straightforward and very honest with children. As you talk to them about suicide, don't worry so much about protecting them. Children really do quite well. In fact, most children do better than we adults do when the grieving process is allowed to continue normally. So we need to be sure that we don't do anything to compound the problem, to restrict the growth through the grieving process. We need to avoid euphemisms. And what I mean by euphemisms is things like, well, Daddy just went to sleep. Mama has gone on a trip and she won't be back for a long, long time. Those are euphemisms, and they have no value. In fact, they are detrimental. They're not true. You're not being honest with the child, and so you need to be honest with them. Sometimes people will say, well, you know, God needed Daddy more than we did, and so God just took him. Well, what is that child? That child who's now going to have to grow up without their father, how is that child going to think of God? God took my daddy away. And it's likely that they'll have a very, very poor understanding of God and a poor relationship with God, the Creator of our salvation. Be honest. I guess I've said that. In case you missed it, be honest. Be honest with your children. Answer questions. No question is off limits. No question is to be compromised. There are some things that you may not know. A child may ask things that you can't answer, and that's okay. But tell them, I don't know. Don't fabricate something, because sooner or later, you know, it's like when parents teach their child all through their life that about these beings at certain holidays, and then when they're 10 years old, they learn that that being isn't real. That places a doubt in the mind of that child. It's very much true in the case of the death in a family, and particularly when there's a suicide involved. Don't tell them that they shouldn't ask or that they shouldn't feel the way they do. Use questions as a teaching opportunity. You don't want to teach them things today that they're going to have to unlearn later on in their life. Things that are not exactly accurate. Also, and this is going to sound maybe a little bit contradictory, but don't over-explain either. You know, it's maybe not a good comparison, but you know, the don't ask, don't tell thing that the military has been talked about. Excuse me. In these situations, you don't have to volunteer things that the child doesn't care about and doesn't really want to know. Excuse me. Again, if I haven't said it before, be honest. Be honest with your children. Listen carefully. Listen carefully to their questions, because their questions sometimes, in one question is hidden another maybe more important question. Let them know that no question is unaskable. It's probably not even a real word. I'm pretty sure it's not a real word. But there is no question that cannot be asked by your children, and you need to be willing to honestly answer them. If they may ask, what did I do? Did Daddy not love me anymore? Why did Mama run away? If those are the things you've told them. Or maybe they may ask a question like, do you still love me? Because they want to know if you're going to be there. One parent has left them, and they want to know, are you still going to be there for them? They need that security. They need to be able to trust. They may ask questions like, was Daddy crazy? Those questions need to be dealt with honestly and very straightforward. But also be consistent, be truthful, be honest. I've said that a time or two. Be honest with them, but also be consistent. Don't give them different versions that do nothing but confuse the child. Be very consistent. And you know, if you just be honest, and if we're always honest, not just in this situation, but in life, if we're just honest, we don't have to worry about being consistent because we will be consistent, like God's Word. It is truth. Jesus said in praying to His Father, John 17:17, sanctify them through Thy Word. Thy Word is truth. Well, it's consistent. It's always the same. And so the same principle really is true for you and I if we'll just live by it and adhere to it. Many times children, they lose their trust in parents that haven't been honest when they figure it out. Kids are not dumb. Children are not stupid. They will figure things out. They'll put two and two together. And if you've put 2 and 2 together and told them it equals 6, they're going to figure out that you've not been honest with them, and then their trust in you has been compromised. And in almost any relationship, but especially a parent-child relationship, almost any relationship, when trust is compromised, it is very, very difficult to restore that trust that was once there, that you've sacrificed because you wanted to protect them. You need to be honest. You may need to repeat your answers. They may ask the same question a number of times. Don't hesitate to repeat. Don't say to them, well, I've already answered that one. We're not going to talk about that anymore. Don't do that to your child. If they ask 10 times, give them the correct, honest answer 10 times. And don't soften it. Don't try to, we used to say, handle it with kid gloves. Be honest. Be very straightforward with your children. Have a respect for their awareness. I read of a situation where a child found the father had hung himself in the closet in their home, and the child was the one that found the body of their father. The mother told the child that Daddy was killed in a car wreck. Well, that child, one, loses its trust for his parent, but it also begins to doubt himself. He begins to doubt whether what he saw, did he see what he thought he saw? And begins to doubt himself and his own ability to observe and comprehend and so forth. So lies don't do anything but cause mistrust, and they cause them to not rely on their own senses. And they may get angry. It may not be today. It may not be tomorrow. It might be when they're 18 years old or when they're 25 years old. And so be honest. You can deal with the anger that is because of the situation, but it's very difficult to deal with the anger that has come upon you because you've not been honest with them. That trust that's lost when we compromise, when we are not straightforward, we're not honest. It's very, very difficult to ever restore that. Involve the children in the process also. Include them. They're going to be naturally curious. We did a program a few weeks ago about children and funerals and so forth. And I mentioned in that program that it's quite common around a grave site that as the people, the workers in the cemetery are filling in the grave, children will gather around the grave and look and watch with great curiosity. Children are naturally curious. Use that curiosity as an opportunity to teach them about the situation that your family is now in, to teach them about God, to teach them about life. Use that to inform and share information with them. Protection by deception is going to backfire. I could almost guarantee it. Keep in mind that you don't have to do this alone. Those of you who are surviving parents and raising children that when your spouse has committed suicide, You don't have to do this alone. You need to be the primary leader in the family and the primary information giver, the primary caregiver for your children, certainly. But you don't have to do it alone. Don't shirk that responsibility, but there's no harm in asking for help. And there is help available, maybe in your church family, maybe in your physical family. Grandparents. I know that can be a very difficult situation when a spouse has committed suicide and the parents of that spouse and the relationship with the surviving spouse. Sometimes those can be very, very difficult. But keep in mind that they're still the grandparents, and they can be of help in the nurturing of the grandchildren. But they have to understand also of your insistence on being honest and straightforward, even when the child asks questions about the grandparent's child, their parent, that the grandparents have to be honest as well. Just a few suggestions. Children may display their grief in different ways than you and I. There may be behavioral changes, and those behavioral changes may manifest them in a number of different ways. May come out as bad behavior, may be grades dropping in school, a lot of different ways that these behaviors can be manifested. Sometimes it will be manifested in the form of physical things like illness, that children can be physically sick. And there may also be some guilt involved. If the parent maybe, sometimes children will just blurt things out. Maybe daddy had given the child a spanking and the child said, "I just wish you'd die." And then later daddy has committed suicide. There may be a great deal of guilt in that child, and we need to take care of that and deal with that. It may manifest itself in anger toward you. It may manifest itself in anger toward the siblings. Be careful that there isn't any cruelty that comes into play and takes place. There's what we sometimes refer to as survivor's guilt by everyone. How do we respond to the guilt? We have to respond with honest assurance, honest answers. Don't compromise the truth. Be honest and truthful with your child. Reassure them, reassure them, reassure them, and then reassure them again. Maintain a good family communication. That's terribly important. But most of all, we have to rely on God to get us through these difficult times. There will be some contact information at the close of our program. I hope you have a great day.